4 Storm Shadow missiles were expensive assets, not irreplaceable, but valuable enough that a marginally planned strike attempt was not worth the cost. The Shevchuk corridor would remain open. The operation could reset for a better window. That provision, the willingness to stand down rather than force a shot under degraded conditions, was the most operationally important part of the entire plan. Not the technology, the discipline. Rehearsals began August 15, 2024. The Mi-8MR detachment flew calibration exercises against Ukrainian air defense systems in a controlled test environment near Kremenchuk, 11 sorties over 3 weeks, refining the Su-27SM-3 spoofing profiles until Lysenko was satisfied with the false contact behavior on test radar screens. The Su-24M strike package flew simulated Shevchuk approach profiles 9 times, each run validating the terrain following routing, the timing window, the egress corridor. The armament crews ran 3 full load and check cycles on practice rounds, verifying that the Storm Shadow targeting parameters updated correctly from Tereshchenko's revised coordinate packages. One rehearsal sortie aborted on final approach when a navigation discrepancy of 340 meters was detected at the waypoint sequencing check. The crew landed. The discrepancy was traced to a data entry error in the mission computer, and the entire package was reflown 2 days later with the corrected parameter set. Shevchuk logged the abort as a successful use of the protocol rather than a setback. The Storm Shadows were updated with final targeting data from Tereshchenko's analysis. The mission brief was revised 3 times as Shevchuk incorporated lessons from each rehearsal cycle. Russian satellite reconnaissance tracked increased Ukrainian air activity in the Mykolaiv region throughout August 2024. Russian intelligence analysts flagged the pattern in their weekly threat assessments. They assessed it as consistent with training operations, not pre-strike preparation. They were looking at exactly the right data and drawing the wrong conclusion. The specific language of the Russian threat assessment, as reconstructed from post-war intelligence disclosures, characterized the elevated activity as routine combat training rotation, a pattern consistent with Ukrainian Air Force preparation for defensive contingencies. The assessment noted the Mi-8MR sorties as electronic warfare proficiency training, a common and expected activity, and the Su-24M flights as consistent with crew qualification maintenance. There were no anomalous indicators that separated this cluster of activity from the baseline of Ukrainian military training that Russian analysts monitored continuously. The assessment was internally consistent. Its conclusions were logical given its inputs. Its inputs were insufficient. The Mi-8MR helicopters flying practice sorties looked precisely like training flights because in a technical sense they were. The Su-24M sorties were routed to avoid suggesting a Crimean target axis. The Russian analytical picture showed no imminent threat to Crimea. That conclusion, reached independently through normal intelligence processes without any Ukrainian active deception, was the third layer of the operation's deception architecture. Passive, unintentional, and perhaps the most effective of all. A senior Russian intelligence officer reviewing that conclusion on September 12th added a note in the margin of the assessment report. Assessed low probability of offensive action within 72 hours. That note was standard analytical product. It was also the last formal assessment of the threat to the Dzhankoi battery before the strike. No revision was issued before September 17th. Looking at the Dzhankoi planning process as a whole, what stands out is how much preparation time went into escape routes, abort conditions, and fallback scenarios rather than the strike itself. 6 weeks of work to build a plan where the actual execution lasted 47 seconds. That ratio, the extraordinary depth of preparation for a brief moment of action, reflects a Ukrainian military planning culture that learned, at enormous cost over 2 years of full-scale war, exactly what happens when you improvise against Russian air defense. The bodies teach the lesson. The survivors apply it. 2 operations in particular shaped the discipline visible in the Dzhankoi plan. The first was the August 2022 attempted strike on Saki airfield, where an Su-24M crew flew a mission profile without adequate radar coverage mapping and encountered a Tor-M2 engagement at a range that should not have been possible given the crew's pre-mission briefing. The discrepancy was traced to an outdated radar position assessment. The aircraft escaped through aggressive maneuvering and damage was limited, but the analytical failure was documented and incorporated into Ukrainian Air Force pre-mission standards. The second was a November 2023 Storm Shadow employment where a target coverage gap was identified post-strike rather than pre-strike, a sequencing failure that Shevchuk specifically referenced in his planning documentation for Dzhankoi as the error to avoid. By September 10, 2024, Shevchuk had a finalized plan and a confirmed strike window. Weather analysis for the Sivash corridor showed optimal conditions for the night of September 16th to 17th. Overcast at 1,800 meters, no moonlight, northwest winds at 12 knots. The overcast would limit Russian optical observation of inbound missiles. The northwest wind would help the My-8MR helicopters hold their spoofing orbit position without excessive fuel expenditure. Strike confirmed for September 17, 2024. On September 16th, Major Taras Kovalenko flew from his home airfield to the dispersal site at a location in the Zaporizhzhia region that remains classified. He carried one personal item with him, a photograph of his daughter. She was 7 years old. He had not seen her in 3 weeks. The 4 Su-24Ms at the dispersal site had been armed with Storm Shadow missiles over the previous 24 hours by armament crews working in rotating shifts under blackout conditions inside hangar structures designed to defeat routine satellite reconnaissance passes. Each aircraft carried 2 missiles, a total of 8 rounds in the strike package, 4 primaries and 4 secondaries. The armament process for each aircraft required approximately 6 hours per round, a deliberate pace that prioritized accuracy over speed. Each Storm Shadow was physically inspected at 4 checkpoints between its storage position and the wing pylon, with targeting data verified against Tereshchenko's final coordinate package at the 3rd checkpoint. A data cryptographer from the strike planning staff was present for each verification. If the targeting data failed the integrity check at any point, the round was flagged and pulled from the manifest. None were. All 8 rounds passed their verification checks within the morning of September 16th. That night, Kovalenko and his crews briefed the mission one final time. Every contingency, every abort trigger, every timing checkpoint. Then they waited. Launch was set for 1:47 a.m. At 1:44 a.m., the operation nearly ended before it began. Lieutenant Denis Shevchuk, piloting one of the 4 Mi-8MR helicopters at the Mykolaiv forward site, reported a hydraulic warning light during pre-departure checks. He shut down the system and called in the fault. The fault was a pressure anomaly in the tail rotor hydraulic assist line, not a failure, but a deviation from the nominal range that crew protocol required to be reported rather than cleared by field inspection. Shevchuk ran the shutdown checklist without shortcuts. A maintenance technician was at the aircraft within 4 minutes. The assessment was that the deviation was likely a sensor artifact, but likely was not the same as certain, and in a blacked-out forward site with no maintenance bay and no spare parts vehicle, certain was not achievable in the available time. Captain Lysenko now had 3 helicopters instead of 4. The spoofing signal effective radiated power dropped by 25%. The false Su-27 returns would appear on Russian radar at reduced signature strength, still within the credibility envelope Lysenko had designed, but with less margin. The ambiguity that was supposed to slow Russian decision-making was now slightly thinner. Lysenko called Shevchuk. Shevchuk had 45 seconds to make the call. He ran the arithmetic that Lysenko had already run. 3 helicopters producing 75% of the designed signal power against a 92N6E tracking function that required approximately 85% of the original design signal to produce unambiguous contact classification. The margin was 10%. That 10% was the difference between a convincing false contact and a potentially questionable one. The mission profile was tight. The abort was available. The 45 seconds expired. He authorized continuation with 3 helicopters. At 1:47:03 a.m., the 3 operational Mi-8MRs began broadcasting their spoofing signatures from their orbit position 180 kilometers northwest of Dzhankoi. At 1:47:15 a.m., the 92N6E gravestone radar at Dzhankoi registered the first false contacts. At 1:52 a.m., the 4 Su-24Ms were airborne. They flew low over the Ukrainian steppe, radar altimeters locked at 60 meters, threading through terrain shadows at 900 kilometers per hour. Night vision goggles, encrypted data links, total radio silence except for essential positional updates on pre-agreed frequencies. The routing took them northwest of Kherson, then south over the sea, then northeast toward the Sivash, avoiding all approach vectors that would suggest a Crimean target axis until the last possible moment. The aircraft flew in a tactical spread with 800-meter lateral separation between elements, far enough to prevent mutual radar cross-section amplification that might produce an anomalous return on Russian long-range surveillance radars, close enough to maintain the visual and data link coordination the formation required. Radar warning receivers in each aircraft were set to passive mode, recording any emissions from Russian ground-based systems without generating any signal of their own. The receivers were quiet until the formation crossed south of Kherson, then briefly, a Nebo-M radar sweep. No lock indication. The sweep did not repeat. Major Kovalenko described the Sivash approach in his post-mission debrief as the strangest flying of his career. Nothing visible below. The lagoon, a black nothing in the overcast darkness, defined only by the terrain-following radar, keeping him 60 meters above a surface he could not see. Waypoints counting down on the navigation display. The storm shadow canisters on the wings, heavy and silent. In his debrief, he described the experience of flying over water at 60 meters altitude in zero visibility conditions as a form of sensory negation. The aircraft instruments were the only reality, the ground and sky indistinguishable, the usual cues of visual flight entirely absent. He said that if you had told him afterward that he had flown those 19 minutes with his eyes closed, he would have believed you. The instruments said he was at 60 meters. He believed the instruments. He held the release point 4 seconds past the calculated window opening before committing. Checking his navigation fix one final time. 4 seconds. The missiles separated from the aircraft and dropped into their terrain-following profiles. Kovalenko rolled right and began his egress climb. His second aircraft released 2 seconds later. Third and fourth aircraft followed. In the post-mission debrief, all 4 aircraft commanders confirmed the same experience at the release point. A moment of complete stillness in which the instruments, the aircraft, and the mission brief became the entire world, and the target 240 kilometers away was simultaneously abstract and absolutely real. The Storm Shadow's terrain-following autopilot took control of the round the moment it separated from the pylon. From that point, the mission belonged to the weapon. The crew's work was done. 8 Storm Shadow missiles in flight, 4 primary targeting rounds, 4 secondaries. They flew the Sivash corridor for 19 minutes, low, fast, following the lagoon's northeastern approach on a profile that held them below radar horizon for the entire transit. At the Dzhankoi position, Naumov had been tracking the false contacts since 1:51 a.m. 36 minutes. He had flagged them to Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Gorev at 1:51. Gorev had woken Colonel Volkov at 1:56. The battery had been at full alert since 2:05. The 4 ON-6E launchers were pressurized. The engagement computer was running continuous firing solutions on the 6 false returns to the west. The entire crew's attention was committed to bearing 271. At 2:23:47 a.m., the 4 primary storm shadows crested the ridge line. At 2:23:49 a.m., the 92N6E registered 4 new contacts simultaneously. Bearing 038, range 31 kilometers, velocity 1,000 kilometers per hour. Naumov stared at his display for 1.8 seconds before calling the contacts. That 1.8 seconds was not negligence. It was the cognitive processing time of a human brain encountering something its training had designated impossible, threat from a non-threat axis, at a range that violated the tactical assumptions baked into every briefing he had received. What Naumov's training had established as a cognitive baseline, the mental model of the threat environment around the Dzhankoi position, did not include a northeast approach vector. Every threat axis he had briefed on, every simulation he had run, every scenario that appeared in the 18th Division's training catalog came from the west, northwest, or south. The northeast was a supply route axis, a friendly logistics corridor, terrain masked against the lagoon. His brain, encountering the 4 contacts at bearing 038, ran the classification protocol and hit a category that did not exist in his training. It resolved the contradiction in 1.8 seconds. It was not fast enough. By the time Gorev reached his console, the missiles were at 27 kilometers. By the time Volkov was notified, they were at 22 kilometers. At 16 kilometers, Volkov had a theoretically viable, if extremely tight, engagement window. He needed to issue the launch command in the next few seconds. The engagement computer already had solutions queued. The launchers were pressurized. The firing order was never given. Whether Volkov attempted to issue it and the command chain collapsed under the time pressure, whether he hesitated, or whether the command and control van was struck before the order could be completed, none of that is known from open sources. Russian Ministry of Defense communications went silent on the Dzhankoi battery at 2:24 a.m. and have never been officially restored to the public record. What the electronic intelligence picture shows is that the 92N6E radar continued transmitting until 2:23:58 a.m., the moment of first impact. The engagement computer was still running its solution set. The launchers remained pressurized. None of the indicators of a command being issued and executed, the specific emission signatures associated with missile launch from the 40N6E system, appeared in the intercept record. Whatever happened in the command and control van in those final 11 seconds, it was not a successful launch command. The first missile hit at 2:23:58 a.m. 47 seconds after the first impact, the 18th Air Defense Division's forward position at Dzhankoi was wreckage. But the story of what came next is as important as the strike itself, because the destruction of the battery was not the end of the plan. It was the beginning. The 180-kilometer radar coverage gap over the Sea of Azov approach corridor to Crimea was immediately visible to Ukrainian air defense analysts monitoring the electronic emissions picture from northern Crimea. The 92N6E at Dzhankoi had gone dark. The secondary coverage from the S-400 battery at Yevpatoria, 140 kilometers to the southwest, could not compensate. The geometry of its radar coverage left a gap that Shevchuk's planning team had precisely mapped over the preceding 6 weeks. Ukrainian planners had pre-positioned assets to exploit that gap the moment it opened. On September 19, 2024, at 4:15 a.m., Ukrainian HIMARS batteries fired a coordinated salvo at the Dzhankoi switching yard. 7 GMLRS rockets, each carrying a 90-kilogram unitary warhead, struck 3 separate track-switching assemblies and the main signals relay building that coordinated train movements through the junction. The eastern approach tracks were shut down within the hour. Dzhankoi's freight throughput capacity fell from approximately 52 trains per day to an estimated 18. The Russian response was rapid. Emergency repair crews arrived by morning, military police sealed the perimeter, and additional air defense assets, a Pantsir S-1 battery, and a supplemental radar station, were ordered to reposition toward Dzhankoi from other Crimean locations. Repositioning those assets meant reducing coverage somewhere else. On September 20th, 2024, Ukrainian ATACMS missiles targeted the fuel storage facility at Armyansk, 40 kilometers north of Dzhankoi, on the main supply route from the mainland. The facility held an estimated 12,000 metric tons of diesel and aviation fuel, approximately 3 weeks of operational reserve for Russian mechanized forces across northern Crimea. The strike package was 6 missiles. A Panzer S-1 battery, repositioned to the Perekop area partly as consequence of the Dzhankoi Gap and partly from routine rotation, intercepted 3 incoming rounds. 3 ATACMS rounds struck the facility. 3 was enough. Secondary explosions from the ignited fuel destroyed the entire storage complex regardless of the 3 intercepts. The fire burned 6 days. Russian logistics assessments from captured documents estimated fuel loss at 9,400 metric tons, a reduction of 78% in the northern Crimean fuel buffer. The intercepted 3 missiles represented approximately $4.5 million in successful Russian air defense expenditure. It saved nothing. The math here: 3 missiles intercepted, 3 through, strategic objective achieved regardless, became a reference case in Ukrainian strike planning doctrine for the remainder of the campaign. The implication was direct. For targets where the strategic effect threshold is low relative to the total strike package, partial interception does not constitute mission failure. The Russian air defense network in Crimea would need to achieve near-total intercept rates to prevent strategic-level damage to logistics infrastructure. Under degraded coverage conditions following the Dzhankoi strike, near-total intercept was not achievable. Russian air defense in Crimea now faced a genuinely uncomfortable arithmetic problem. They had enough capability to reduce the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes, but not enough to prevent those strikes from achieving strategic effect. The S-400 at Dzhankoi was the system capable of stopping Storm Shadow at safe ranges. Without it, the chain of events that followed was structurally determined. The Russian military understood this within 72 hours of the initial strike. Their first response was not to adapt the deployment model, but to plug the specific gap, to replace the Dzhankoi battery with equivalent capability as quickly as possible. An S-300V4 battery was ordered to reposition to the northern Crimea area. Additional Panzer S-1 units were diverted from Sevastopol deployments. Russian Air Force patrol activity over northern Crimea increased substantially, but the Shevchuk corridor approach, once identified and publicized through the strike's aftermath, could no longer be treated as a non-threat axis. Russian radar units in the Perekop area began specifically monitoring the northeastern approach geometry. A new ground-based early warning radar station was reportedly established near the lagoon's northern margin within 3 weeks of the strike. The specific vulnerability that Tereshchenko identified had been closed. Others existed. The analytical methodology that produced the Dzhankoi strike was not a one-time exploit. It was a systematic process. Identify air defense positions, map their radar coverage geometries against actual terrain features, find where the coverage assumptions and the physical terrain do not match, and build a deception plan that exploits the mismatch. That process is applicable to any fixed air defense position in Russian-occupied territory. Russian air defense commanders knew this. Ukrainian strike planners knew this. The question was not whether the methodology would be applied again, but where. The Armyansk fuel strike surfaces a broader issue that shapes the Ukrainian strategic situation in Crimea. Partial interception does not equal mission failure when the target is flammable and unprotected. But for hardened targets, or for systems where each individual warhead matters, command bunkers, radar facilities, point installations, the degraded air defense capability is more important. The Russian Panzer proved it could intercept ATACMS under favorable conditions. If the Dzhankoi S-400 had still been operational, those same ATACMS would likely have been intercepted much earlier in their flight path, at ranges where course correction or target reassignment is not possible. The takeaway for Ukrainian strike planners was precise. Air defense suppression had to come first before every follow-on precision strike campaign into Crimea. destroy the radar coverage. Everything after becomes geometrically easier. Over the 5 weeks following September 17, 2024, Ukrainian forces executed 11 strike operations into Crimean airspace that Shevchuk's post-strike analysis assessed as only possible under the degraded coverage conditions created by the Dzhankoi Gap. The operations destroyed a signals intelligence facility at Saki, a helicopter maintenance depot near Bakhchisarai, 2 petroleum transfer nodes in the northern supply chain, and a command and control facility for Russian naval aviation operating from Crimean airfields. The cumulative assessed value of assets destroyed across those 5 weeks, approximately $890 million. The cost of the operation that opened the window, approximately $6 million for 4 Storm Shadow rounds, plus Mi-8MR operational costs. A strategic return of roughly 148 to 1. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface until you think it through. The Dzhankoi battery was destroyed in 47 seconds, but its destruction generated strategic effects for 5 weeks. In that span, the battery's absence was a continuous force multiplier. Every Ukrainian strike planner's targeting calculus for Crimea changed the moment that coverage gap opened. The gap was simultaneously a tactical hole and a strategic lever, and the Ukrainians were prepared to use it as both from the first hours of September 17th. This will draw some pushback. The destruction of the Dzhankoi battery is not fundamentally a story about a tactical failure by the 18th Air Defense Division. Naumov, Gorev, Volkov, they executed their trained procedures. The 1.8 seconds Naumov spent processing the new contacts before calling them is not a meaningful failure by any realistic standard of human cognitive performance under stress. The failure was institutional. It was the Russian military's collective decision, made at general officer level in Moscow, to deploy $1.2 billion worth of irreplaceable air defense hardware in a predictable static position, covering a known high-value logistics node, without adequate analysis of the approach corridor vulnerabilities and without sufficient radar redundancy to detect Sivash masked ingress. That decision was built on an institutional assumption that the S-400 is essentially invulnerable to Ukrainian capabilities. That assumption was not validated against the specific electromagnetic and terrain environment of the Dzhankoi position. It was not tested against the actual capabilities of Ukrainian electronic warfare or the actual intelligence analysis skills of officers like Tereshchenko. It was assumed because the system was the most capable Russia had, and because Russian air defense doctrine had not seriously grappled with the scenario in which a relatively low-budget electronic warfare deception package could neutralize it. Most coverage of this strike won't say it directly. The soldiers who died at Dzhankoi paid for their general's overconfidence. Storm Shadow is an exceptional missile. Ukrainian EW is sophisticated. Both are true. The lesson of September 17th is neither of them. The lesson is that no air defense system remains invulnerable to an adversary willing to spend 6 weeks systematically mapping its terrain geometry and designing a spoofing package calibrated precisely to its human operator's decision cycle. That lesson applies beyond Crimea, beyond Ukraine, beyond this war. What would you have done if you were the Russian battery commander in Volkov's position that night? The Pantsir crew at Perekop intercepted 3 of 6 ATACMS on September 20th. They did their job correctly under the circumstances. The crew at Dzhankoi tracked a credible false contact picture for 36 minutes before the real threat appeared from the wrong direction. These were trained professionals responding to the information environment they had been given. Whether the system failed them, or they failed the system, or whether any individual decision could have changed an outcome that was structurally determined by institutional choices made months earlier, drop your answer in the comments. We read every response on this one, and it genuinely splits experienced analysts. By October 1st, 2024, 2 weeks after the strike, the strategic picture in northern Crimea had shifted in ways that would have seemed implausible in August. The Dzhankoi junction was operating at approximately 35% of its pre-September 17th capacity. Emergency Russian repair operations had restored one of 3 approach track sections. HIMARS continued striking newly repaired segments faster than Russian engineers could complete them. Russian mechanized units in the northern Crimean defensive positions had begun what official Russian military communications described as a readjustment of defensive lines. Ukrainian military analysts translated this phrase as a phased withdrawal from forward positions that could no longer be adequately supplied through the damaged logistics corridor. The fall of the Dzhankoi battery had started a chain reaction that Russian commanders were actively struggling to slow. But the Russian military is adaptive. It learns at significant cost, but it learns. By early October 2024, Ukrainian electronic intelligence assets monitoring Crimean S-400 battery emission patterns detected significant operational changes. Batteries that had previously maintained continuous, predictable radar emission schedules began varying their active periods on irregular cycles. Units that had occupied fixed positions for months began relocating on unpredictable rotations. Russian air defense commanders were implementing survivability through unpredictability, the doctrinal response to a demonstrated ability to locate, analyze, and strike static radar positions. The problem is that emission control discipline extracts a capability cost. An S-400 battery radiating only intermittently provides intermittent coverage. Ukrainian strike planners monitoring those emission patterns began timing operations to coincide with radar dark windows. The Dzhankoi strike had forced the Russian air defense network in Crimea into a binary dilemma where every response to one vulnerability created a new one. Stay active and become a target, or reduce emissions and reduce effectiveness. There is no clean resolution to that dilemma. It persists. One detail that stuck with me when reviewing the post-strike analysis. In the 6 weeks following September 17th, Russian satellite and aerial reconnaissance activity over the Mykolaiv and Zaporizhzhia regions increased substantially. Russia was looking for the My-8MR detachment, the Su-24M dispersal site, the operational infrastructure behind the Dzhankoi strike. They were looking in approximately the right area. They did not find what they were looking for. Because the Ukrainian military, having planned Operation Midnight Lagoon with the same methodical discipline applied to the strike itself, had dispersed and concealed the relevant assets within 72 hours of the operation's completion. The Su-24Ms were back at their home airfields on routine schedules. The Mi-8MR helicopters were at a different dispersal site. The planning staff was in Kyiv. The operational security around the execution matched the operational security around the planning. The Ukrainians did not leave an exploitable trail. Russian retaliation for the Dzhankoi strike came in a different form on September 25, 2024. Russian long-range aviation launched a coordinated package toward Ukrainian air bases in the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. 14 Kh-101 cruise missiles, 8 Shahed-136 loitering munitions, and 2 Kh-47M, 2 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. The strike was designed to attrite Ukrainian aviation infrastructure and signal that Russian precision strike capability remained intact. Ukrainian air defenses, operating at peak readiness in the aftermath of Dzhankoi, engaged the incoming package. The results were the most successful interception numbers Ukrainian air defense had achieved to that date in the full-scale war. 12 of 14 Kh-101s destroyed in flight, all 8 Shaheds intercepted, 1 Kinzhal destroyed by a Patriot battery. The second Kinzhal struck a maintenance facility at a Ukrainian airfield in Dnipropetrovsk region, causing structural damage. No aircraft were destroyed. 3 personnel were injured. The Russian strike was expensive and tactically ineffective, but it demonstrated something the Dzhankoi strike had not eliminated: Russian capacity to reach Ukrainian territory at scale. The asymmetry of the conflict, Ukraine striking Russian military assets in occupied territory, Russia striking Ukrainian infrastructure, was not resolved on September 17th. It was unchanged. What changed was one specific element of the tactical geometry over one specific piece of occupied Crimea. That distinction matters for understanding what Dzhankoi was and was not. The final chapter of the Dzhankoi story is still being written as of this recording. By November 2024, Russian forces had repositioned replacement air defense assets to northern Crimea. Two S-300V4 batteries, a substantially reinforced Panzer S-1 presence, and new low-altitude surveillance radars specifically designed to improve detection of terrain-masked approaches from the Sivash Lagoon direction. The S-300V4, while less capable than the S-400 against some threat profiles, provides meaningful radar coverage and can engage cruise missiles at ranges sufficient to complicate storm shadow attack profiles against the Dzhankoi area. The specific window that Tereshchenko identified in July 2024 has been at least partially closed. But the Russian military does not have an unlimited supply of S-400 batteries. Each unit committed to Crimea is a unit not available for air defense of other critical positions across Russian-occupied territory and within Russia itself. The redistribution math is visible in the intelligence picture. Russian air defense density in some other sectors of the front line decreased in the months following Dzhankoi, as assets were pulled to address the Crimean gap. Every solution the Russian military applied to the Dzhankoi problem created a secondary problem somewhere else on the map. That is the strategic legacy of September 17, 2024. Not just a destroyed battery, a systemic resource allocation problem that Russian air defense planners are still working through in trade-offs that are not publicly visible, but that shape the tactical environment across the entire theater. Major Taras Kovalenko landed at the dispersal site at 4:13 a.m. on September 17th. His debrief with Shevchuk's strike coordination team lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. He answered every question in precise operational detail: release timings, navigation reference checks, the 4-second hold at the window edge, post-release egress routing, communication status throughout. At the end of the debrief, he went back to the aircraft dispersal area and slept on a cot for 11 hours. The photograph of his daughter was on the floor beside him. She was 7 years old. He has not spoken publicly about the operation. His name was not officially disclosed by the Ukrainian military until late 2024, and even then only in the context of a broader unit citation that mentioned the strike in general terms without operational specifics. The technical language of military operations describes what he did as a precision strike mission: execution within tolerance, timing validated, target effect confirmed, mission complete. What that language does not carry is what it means to fly 4 aircraft at 60 meters altitude over an invisible lagoon in total darkness toward a target that will, if the timing deviates by more than about 30 seconds, be capable of defending itself effectively. What it does not carry is Lysenko's decision to proceed with 3 helicopters instead of 4 when one reported the hydraulic fault. That 45 seconds of deliberation where the entire 6 weeks of preparation hung on a phone call. What it does not carry is Tereshchenko staring at a satellite photograph of a salt lagoon in July 2024 and noticing a ridge that no one else had noticed. Those are the human moments inside the operational narrative. Comment yes if you want us to do a full deep dive on the follow-on ATACMS and HIMARS operations that exploited the Dzhankoi coverage gap over the following 5 weeks. We have the targeting data, the satellite imagery timeline, and the Russian logistics assessment that was captured and published by Ukrainian intelligence in October. That story has never been fully told in one place, and it is worth telling. September 17, 2024, 2:23 a.m. to 2:24 a.m., 47 seconds. The S-400 Triumph battery at Dzhankoi, $1.2 billion. Category 1 combat ready. Operated by a 23-year veteran commander and a trained professional crew. Deployed to protect the most strategically critical logistics node in occupied Crimea. Gone before Colonel Volkov could issue a firing command. Not because Storm Shadow is magic, Not because Ukrainian pilots are superhuman, not because the Russian crew failed, because Colonel Vasyl Tereshchenko looked at a satellite photograph of a rust-brown salt lagoon in July 2024 and noticed a ridge that everyone else had overlooked. Because Captain Yuri Lysenko flew 3 helicopters when the plan called for 4 and made the margin hold. Because Colonel Andriy Shevchuk built an abort protocol into a plan tight enough to need one. Because Major Taras Kovalenko held his release 4 seconds past the window's opening edge to verify his navigation fix before committing. What happened at Dzhankoi was not a triumph of technology over technology. It was a triumph of analytical rigor over institutional assumption. The war in Ukraine is, among its many dimensions, a conflict being fought at the intersection of intelligence precision and operational execution. Understanding that intersection is understanding something real about what modern warfare actually looks like at the system level, not the individual weapon, not the individual pilot, but the 6 weeks of preparation that makes the 47 seconds possible. We cover this kind of operational depth twice a week on this channel. If you want to see the follow-on operations, the electronic warfare evolution, and what Russian air defense adaptation in Crimea looks like from the open-source data picture, the subscribe button is there, the bell notification means you will not miss what comes next, and we will see you in the next video.